Hi, and welcome to the Engaging People podcast. My name is Charles Rogel. I'll be moderating our discussion today. Today, I am joined by Spencer Taylor.
Hi, everybody.
Spencer is a consultant here at DecisionWise, and today we're going to be talking about the topic of optimism. Spencer, do you want to introduce this topic for us?
You bet. I think we're living in a very interesting time. I think it's very relevant to talk about optimism right now with all that's going on in the world. We have this whole COVID-19 pandemic. There's a lot of fear and an unknown, I guess you could say, an unknown future. So it's great to emphasize being optimistic through times like this, not in the sense of pretending like these issues don't exist, but recognizing that specifically in the context of HR leaders being able to kind of guide their people and work with leadership teams, that optimism can be a powerful tool to help people stay on track and stay focused, those sorts of things. So that's part of why I'm excited to talk about this today. I think it's going to be important for the times we're living in.
Great. And so you want to talk about, your definition of optimism, how you kind of want to set this up?
You know, I'm a father of 6. And so like 80% of my examples come from Disney movies.
Right.
So I thought of a Pixar movie, Inside Out. There's a scene in that movie where Sadness, this very non-optimistic character.
Right. Antithesis of optimism.
Yeah, there you go. She and Joy are together and they're basically lost. They're trying to find their way back to like their headquarters. Hopefully people will watch the movie if they haven't seen it so they know what we're talking about here. But Sadness says to Joy, as Joy is leading the way into this unknown territory, "You could get lost in there," she says. And Joy responds and says, "Think positive." And Sadness replies, "Okay, I'm positive you'll get lost in there."
It's classic.
So it's kind of an example of, I guess, a twisted version of optimism, but that's not the version we're talking about today.
Sure. And so in your experience then, as it's played out, what are some other ways that you've seen optimism or experienced optimism?
I thought of a leader from our past, one of our past presidents, John F. Kennedy, as I was considering this topic and what we might chat about today. I think most people, when they think of John F. Kennedy, have very positive views or positive memories. They're very optimistic about the way he served. The truth is, when we look at history, he had plenty of failures. He had a lot of mistakes he made in some of his early efforts as the diplomatic part of his role, where some international relations didn't go so well early on. And then even militarily, the Bay of Pigs, for example, was it's
a huge failure.
Yeah, it's a pretty big deal. I did a kind of a straw poll leading up to this just through my social network on LinkedIn and Facebook, and asked people to share a one-word summary of what came to mind when they thought of JFK.
Yeah.
And nobody said pigs or Bay of Pigs or even failure. People tend to remember the good stuff. So I think for me, the principle there is when we're going through hard things, it's nice to reflect on the successes of the past and to learn lessons from our history and to carry those principles forward in a way that where we use them as tools as to how we can behave through the more challenging times when there are kind of storms blowing about us.
Yeah, we definitely have a tendency to focus on our failures or mishaps, and that tends to undermine our confidence in ourselves.
It really does. Yeah, and it brings to mind an experience I had. I was actually in China during my MBA program. We went there, like a lot of programs do, an international piece of the experience. And we were standing outside the Forbidden City and just basically waiting in line for our turn to go in. And there was kind of a commotion. There were a lot of people around us, definitely more than 10 in our current context. It was not a social distancing scenario. Of course, we hadn't really even heard of that back then. But all of a sudden, there were all these papers that somebody threw up in the air. And of course, everyone's attention was drawn toward this. And out of nowhere, all of these Chinese officials, I guess I would just call them policemen, came and gathered up all the papers and took the person away. And after the dust kind of settled from that whole commotion, we realized that these leaflets were some type of speaking out against the government. There was something this person was unhappy with, and they had thrown this up in the air, hoping to get the word out, basically. But truly, I don't think any of those papers hit the ground. Like, they were just collected up and taken away. And again, this is, I guess, a kind of a perspective story, I guess, when I'm having a hard day or something's going wrong, just to pause and think about how fortunate I am or how I feel to live here in the USA, where we can share our voice, having experiences on the other side of that, seeing that not everyone gets to live the way that we live, helps us, again, kind of blow the dust off of a negative situation and hopefully proceed with an optimistic view.
That's for sure. Yeah.
So I guess this story from China, I think about it as kind of experiencing the other side of life. It's good to, again, sometimes see what we don't have to
Right.
appreciate what we do have.
It's kind of what parents want for their kids, right? You guys are so spoiled. You got to be grateful for what you have.
It's really true. Yeah, my wife and I talk about that a lot, trying to figure out how to give kids that perspective. So I guess another best practice that I've thought about is just I think it helps to stay optimistic if we're always thirsty for new knowledge, to study across disciplines. One of my favorite things about what we do here at DecisionWise is we get to touch a lot of different industries. In fact, you and I had an experience, Charles, recently when we were traveling to a client site. You told me a story about a dairy farming group that you had worked with, and as you described the type of work they do, I mean, if we think about dairy farmers, and you taught me this, I had never thought about it, but it's an industry that never sleeps, because cows are always producing milk, and the farmers who work in that industry also basically never sleep. Like, they have to just keep going. If a piece of equipment breaks down, it creates this bottleneck, and it's kind of this cascading effect of burden that they have to carry. So even just, again, this is a little micro example of learning across industries and seeing, I guess, different lessons through considering that. My takeaway as I thought about what you shared with me was, number one, I'm glad I'm not a dairy farmer.
All right.
For sure. I mean, I'm thankful at the same time for those who are, because I like milk and ice cream. But also, how can I apply the practices of a successful dairy farmer in the way I do my work? How can I think about the way I approach our work in helping companies create a great employee experience, but borrowing some of those lessons of what if a certain constraint was completely out of my control? What if companies might struggle right now, for example, with being able to retain all of their people as these hardships are going on? How can they potentially navigate that and communicate with their people in a way that people feel appreciated, but the company is also able to continue forward?
So you make a point here about deciding daily in terms of how optimistic you are.
Yeah, there's a great book by Martin Seligman, wrote a book called Learned Optimism. Fantastic book. He really addresses the truth that that it's possible to learn optimism. I mean, as the title implies. Optimism isn't one of those things where you're either born with it or you're not. And it kind of walks through a sequence of how we can train our brains to think about failure in a different light. In fact, just this morning, I was listening to a presentation, I guess, a speech, and this individual said that success is not the absence of failure, but it's being able to go from failure to failure without any loss of enthusiasm or loss of optimism, I think, is another way we could say that. And again, if we're in a place where we're naturally more inclined to see things through kind of the pessimist's perspective, then we might look to Martin Seligman's book as kind of a model or a blueprint on how we can shape our thinking. So he has kind of a few different pieces of his model, and I won't give an exhaustive review here, but just to touch on a couple of the pieces that really stood out to me. The pessimist might say something like, I am a terrible or incapable person who just doesn't have what it takes. In other words, something's wrong with me, and this failure that I've experienced is personal. This means I'm broken,
It's
essentially.
like a character thing, yeah.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. So it's this idea of permanence, or it's a personal failure. The second component that pessimists might have arise in a tough situation is that I can't change who I am, and my circumstances won't change. So the first that I mentioned is really talking about personal failure, taking it personally.
Yeah.
Second is more a state of permanence, that things won't change, that this is just how it is. And then the third is, because I'm a failure in this one way, I'm a failure in every way. So it's pervasive. So those 3 P's, taking it personal, looking at it as a permanent situation, and then it's a pervasive truth that percolates into every part of life.
Geez, that's depressing.
It's hard, isn't it, to just think about things that way?
Yeah.
So to flip things back around to the optimist perspective, and again, hopefully the listener can consider, I think we all get stuck in a loop like that once in a while when something bad happens. And so just thinking about those thought processes in contrast to the following 3, again, looking at those same P's, personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness, instead of what has been shared in the last couple of minutes here, we can think, what happened, this failure was unfortunate, but it was not personal. I'm not defined by one bad situation. To me, that's really refreshing. Even just saying those words, it's kind of like pulling the blinds up on a sunny day and letting the sun in.
Yeah.
It just feels better to think about it that way. And that's just a truth. There's nobody in the world that is a failure. I think the key is, again, as HR leaders work with their teams and maybe they're coaching people or counseling with people who are having a hard time, especially right now with all that's going on. For example, even if they have to lay somebody off, they can emphasize that this person is not a failure. This is just a tough situation, and it will get better. So that people don't have to be defined by one bad situation. Second, the permanence element, this situation represents a temporary setback. Again, it's something bad that has happened. I don't think we should ever ignore a tough thing. We need to face it head on, but it's temporary. There's not permanence there. And then the third element, this stumble, or this bad thing that's happened, only applies to this specific situation and not to future situations, especially not to my core identity. So that's huge, I think. Maybe of the 3, that could be the most important, just because if we allow it to spill over into everything else, regardless of whichever one we choose to be on the side of, whether we're looking at it as the pessimist or the optimist, that one can kind of be that domino effect into every other thought that we have, really, and has an effect on everything.
I've seen this kind of play out in 2 ways. One, or 2 examples. I look at like my teenage sons playing video games, and they expect, like once they get a new game or start a new game, they expect to fail repeatedly until they get better. And so the expectations there is they get into it, they start failing until they learn how not to fail at certain things. They just kind of learn the game. But they understand that failing is part of the learning and growing experience of it. And the other thing there is that there's not any risk. So they know when they get in there, it's not personal. It's not, like you're saying here, it's not permanent. And that it doesn't mean they're going to fail in everything else. And then I also see this a lot in entrepreneurs. If you think about successful entrepreneurs, they have failed a lot throughout their life. They might have failed 9 times before they hit it big on whatever their 10th attempt at success in a certain business. And many of them have many different businesses going on, many plates in the air. And they always expect to fail, but they have a lot of confidence in themselves. They know that when they fail, when they lose a ton of money, that they themselves are able to, pick the pieces up and start over again and be successful in some way. So it's definitely this optimist mentality that they have that helps them be successful.
I love that. And I especially love that you just helped shape my view of video games toward a positive.
Right.
I don't completely hate them, but it's hard to watch your kids spend so much time on video games. But I love what you shared, because there are lessons they can learn even in that context of a virtual experience like that. So thank you. I think another important thing to consider is there a positive side to pessimism?
Sure.
Is kind of one way to think about it. There's a psychologist named Julie Norham. She shared the idea that there's such a thing as what she coined defensive pessimism, in the sense that it can be productive in helping us anticipate negative events because it allows us to come up with strategies to avoid them and potentially even negate the whole negative scenario. So there is I think there's this healthy balance between being optimistic and realistic, having a clear view of a situation. And again, Julie Norham's, I like this term, defensive pessimism, not in the sense that we become a pessimist, but that we say, what could go wrong here? And then being able to program in a solution before the bad situation becomes a failure.
Sounds like something an optimist would say.
I think so. Yeah, I can learn from that for sure.
So we talk a lot about engagement here, and sometimes I think people conflate the topic or the term optimism with engagement. And so how would you connect those two together?
Such an important place for us to go, I think, as we look to wrap this conversation about optimism, because there is a direct connection. As organizations, especially as organizations identify their key influencers, we talk about them internally here and with clients as engagement ambassadors, these people that have the ability to really shape the organization from the inside out. Those engagement ambassadors will have the ability to really build an environment where optimism is the norm. So we've come up with just a few statements around our core model here at DecisionWise is engagement magic, or the magic framework as we call it. So meaning, autonomy, growth, impact, connection, that's what each of those letters stand for. And so here are a few examples of statements for each one of those that represent that positive mantra that, again, those ambassadors and the HR leaders who are working with them can utilize to kind of build out the theme for how they'll infuse more optimism into the culture moving forward. So when we think about meaning, we can say something like, we are doing an important work. We can connect our personal vision and goals to the vision and goals of our organization. It allows us to see that our actions today have an impact not only in our own lives, but can truly have an impact across the organization tomorrow and beyond. Autonomy, our leaders trust us to do our work in the way we feel is best. We've got a couple statements, one of which directly addresses that, the idea that all of us want the freedom to do our work in the way we feel is best, and then a couple of others that come at that obliquely. And we found that there's often a strong correlation directly to engagement when we can help people feel that way, that leaders trust us to do our work. Growth, as we press forward together, we will have abundant opportunities for personal and professional growth. And it's just a natural desire all of us have to grow, and none of us wants to stagnate. And usually when we begin to stagnate is essentially when we begin to die. I think you could say you just cease to kind of exist and fill the measure of your potential.
I think it's to your point where failure as a step to growth, right? Or as an opportunity for growth.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, I think that's such an important viewpoint. Again, not to say we want to completely avoid failure, but rather leverage failure as a lesson, I guess, a lesson learned and a resource to carry forward with an expanded perspective. So these last two, impact, the kind of the mantra behind that can be, when we apply our best efforts and work effectively together, we can make an impact in a way that improves lives. Again, that you can kind of hopefully read between the lines of that and feel those principles earlier from our conversation about the different kind of the way a pessimist looks at things versus an optimist. There's clearly that optimistic bent. And then connection. Our relationships are among our greatest assets. Pulling together is far superior to trying to go it alone. That's a really unique one, I think, especially with where we are today. We have this whole social distancing thing. Normally, you and I, Charles, would be in a smaller room right across the table from each other. We've got this different format so that we're at least 6 feet apart today, right? And that's okay with both of us here. But in a family sense or community sense, whatever, people are used to gathering and socializing and connecting much more than we are able to do today as we each do our part here. So I think it's important for organizations also to think of how to increase connection, even in a world where the physical large gatherings aren't as viable, at least for the short term.
Good point. So how would you wrap this up? I guess advice for managers, HR leaders?
Yeah, I think as a concluding statement, we can just think of the importance of engaging with our people to find how much optimism they feel about what's going on in the world. And again, we might hear some thoughts about the pessimism as well, and just have a chance to talk about how the way we see things around us, whether we see obstacles or opportunities, will really shape what's next. I think the truth is, if we can program optimism into our organizations at a deeper level, that we'll actually come out of this current global challenge stronger and better than when we went into it. And I think that's the best thing any of us can hope for, both as individuals as well as teams and organizations. So that's my hope today.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Spencer. Appreciate the advice today. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Anything else that you'd like to say?
Just that it's been a pleasure. I appreciate you, Charles. You're a fine example of somebody I want to try to emulate, and you're one of those optimists, so thank you.
I'm a cynical optimist.
I'll take it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.